Good evening and welcome to tonight's show. Tonight's show, the topic for tonight, we're going to focus on the role of Rwandan youth in fighting genocide denial. Some of the key topics we'll be looking at under this big topic is to do with the legal implications, also look at the growing rise of genocide denial, especially amongst Rwandan youth in the diaspora, as well as other issues with regard to do with education and mindset change of youth. Of course, we're kicking off this show, just as we also officially start the commemoration of the 27th year of the genocide against the Tutsi since 1994. With us, we have a very youthful panel, and I'm happy to introduce with us. And I'll start with all the way, if I'm not mistaken, all the way from South Africa. We have with us Doris Uwicheza-Picard. If we could have her on our screens. Doris is a legal researcher and international law specialist. Doris, great to have you on the square.
Thank you for having me.
We're also joined by Bruce Inwari Murangira, who is a marketing and communication specialist. Bruce, great to have you on the square.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here.
Great. We'll have Bruce on those screens once again. But basically, we have our young panel with us talking about youth. We also have the Square resident panelists with us. I'll start over with you, Charles Haber, resident panelist on the Square. Great to have you on the show.
Same here, Dana. How are you?
Good.
Good.
We also have with us Berna Namata, a resident panelist on the Square. Great to have you on the show, Berna.
Thank you, Dana.
Great. As always, before we kick off, there's a midweek highlight I think our Square resident panelists would like to share. Charles, is there something you'd briefly like to touch on?
Of course, there's a lot of stuff happening, and one of my biggest problems is around policing COVID. Mm-hmm. Throughout the last 2 years, we've made a pledge to our viewers that will ensure that we talk about COVID and COVID-related matters. And I'm not too happy that a bride and groom were paraded after their, whatever it was. I'm not too sure it was after their church, civil. I'm not too sure about what happened, but it's extremely painful. I'm bothered. It didn't matter whether it was right or wrong. Totally unacceptable.
I think people would, I don't want us to give us too much time to that because we have an important topic to talk about, but I think people would also, rather than playing devil's advocate or actually, supporting what was done, is that people would say that, rules are rules. You break them, whether it's a wedding, whether it's a funeral, you'll be held accountable. Maybe the visuals of it were a bit emotive, I think that's what most people responded to. I think that's a conversation worth having on the show. Policing COVID, looking at how...
It's an opinion show.
It's an opinion show, exactly, absolutely. That's what I was saying. On the other side, I think this is what other people would be saying. But I totally agree with you, Charles, on the, it was a bit tough to take in, especially for the public. Sorry?
Rough, not tough.
Rough and tough. So we're here to discuss the role of the Rwandan youth in fighting genocide denial. My name is Dana PC, host of The Square. And of course, I would love to kick off the first question to our panelists. I will start with Bruce. If we could have Bruce on our screens. I know we didn't when we kicked off, but I wanted to ask this question to Bruce and Doris Uwicheza-Picard. There's been a steady rise in promoting genocide denial amongst Rwandan youth based in the diaspora. Of course, most of them we've seen will be inheriting this mindset from their elders or their parents or people that they look up to, people who, and these are youth who didn't have personal responsibility per se, but are really perpetuating a narrative of genocide denial. Now, when it comes to youth in Rwanda or even youth in the diaspora who are involved in making sure this genocide denial does not happen, what are some ideas of what can be done? And also, what are you doing in your capacity, Bruce and Doris, to engage in efforts to really counter genocide denial amongst Rwandan youth, especially in the diaspora? And Bruce, I'll kick off with you.
Thank you very much. I think maybe before we get to talk about what can be done and what we're doing, maybe we could look a little bit at what are the reasons and the causes of young people, being the ones to perpetuate denial narratives. And in the diaspora, it's maybe not to try and simplify it, but I would say it's a bit self-explanatory in the sense that most of the people who actually perpetuate these narratives in the diaspora are descendants of people who, whether very directly or indirectly, took part in what happened in Rwanda in 1994. And, we all know that the very first kind of education, whether on genocide or anything else, starts at home. And so if we have parents that are indoctrinating their children into these kinds of narratives of, oh, no, genocide didn't happen, what happened was actually a mass revolt of people, or genocide did happen, but it was a double genocide, and they're not in a space where they can easily be confronted with, narratives that counter that bring out the reality of what happened. That can be a reason for this. And so I think that one of the best things to do is to try. I always believe that as much as we can talk about, theories and things like that, the best way to counter denial narratives is to amplify the voices of the survivors, to really allow them to say, this is what happened to me. You may try to theorize it in a different way, you may try to twist it, but this is the reality of things, and I am here as living proof that what happened was a genocide. It was a genocide against the Tutsi, and there's no two ways about it. And so what I would say that I've been doing along with a group of friends is something that actually came out of necessity last year. When April came around, it was in the middle of a lockdown, the very first lockdown, which was a bit of a total lockdown. And we realized that we weren't going to be able to congregate physically and be able to be there for each other in a very physical way. But we thought that, that shouldn't stop us from creating spaces where we allow survivors to be comforted, where we allow them to see that they're not alone, and where we amplify their voices, as I was saying. And so what we started was an initiative we called Digital Kwibuka. And throughout the week last year, we curated a number of discussions. Some of them were really on genocide education, and some of them were just to be able to amplify the voices of survivors and highlight their experiences during and after the genocide, looking at different categories of these people. So we talked to women, we talked to the post-genocide generation, all of whom in one way or another have been affected by the genocide. And we're actually doing the same thing again this year. We started the campaign today, and it's going to go on for the whole week. So that is what we've been doing, amplifying the voices of survivors, but also a major part of it comes back to education. Education in the sense that and I believe this is also very valid for Rwandan youth, especially we hear all these talks about, oh, young people are not very interested in taking part in commemoration activities, young people are not involved. And so one of the questions becomes, why are they not involved? And it's partly because there is something that is lacking in the way that we have studied about the genocide. The facts are there. I'm speaking for Rwanda. And we've really gone very deep into highlighting them. But for someone who did not live through the genocide, being very cognizant of the facts does not change the fact that they're very disconnected from it. It's not that much different from learning in class about the Holocaust or World War II or World War I. And so one thing that I always advocate for is that we should also try to look more at the psychological aspect of how genocide came to be, because that will allow people to really connect. It will allow people to say, this is not just something that happened out of the blue, it was a process, and there were reasons why people, for example, who had been living in clans and had been living in social classes where social mobility was a reality, believed very easily, the new notion of ethnicity when it was cemented in 1932. So what were the causes of that? And when we realized that genocide is not something that happens out of the blue. It is a reaction of psychological processes that, if we're not careful, might happen again. Not necessarily in the sense of ethnicity, but maybe race, maybe religion, maybe gender. And then we're able to say, oh, this concerns me too, and I need to be careful. I need to be, to be able to identify some of these things, some of these symptoms of mass violence when I see them in my community, and be able to do something about it.
Thank you very much, Bruce. It's refreshing to hear someone as young as yourself speaking very eloquently, and also, with really solid information about the issue that we're talking about tonight. And thank you for kicking off by giving us even context about why this genocide denial amongst young people, especially in the diaspora, is happening. I would like us to go to our Skype guest, Doris, if we could have on the guest. Doris, I'd like to also hear you weigh in on what Bruce just said before I hear from the resident panelists on, the reasons as to why this is happening, what can be done to counter this counter-narrative, genocide denial, especially amongst youth, and what is the role of youth in trying to combat this narrative. Over to you, Doris.
Yes, thank you. I think the issue of genocide deniers and the fact that it is much more on the rise today is directly correlated with the access that social media allows us. But the rhetoric is still the same. It is the same genocide denial rhetoric that was used by their fathers. If we I know they use there's constantly this attitude. Scholars argue that denial of a genocide is the last stage of a genocide, but it's actually a misnomer, if you will, because this is something that denial starts even during the planning phase of a genocide, and during the implementation of a genocide, and even after. So you will find that genocide denial is something that has kicked off mostly. It can be traced back to the camps in Zaire where the ex-FAR refugees were, and they started. These were educated people. The people who were directly involved in the genocide were educated people, and they realized that they needed this international support. So they went on a charm offensive within the UN, within all these organizations, international organizations, and a lot of the rhetoric can be traced back to what they were saying even as the genocide was occurring, when they were justifying the genocide at the UN. And they have access to all those institutions, including Amnesty and all of those institutions. So these people have a strategy that has been in place because they're educated. They're not these mindless beasts. These are people who planned and executed a genocide, and they're educated and they had strategies in mind, strategies that they learned. So these people continued their rhetoric through their children, but it's not just their children. See, this is something that I've noted. There's a distinction between those genocide deniers. There are the children of the perpetrators and the relatives of the perpetrators, people who do not have a legal responsibility in the genocide, as you said, but have some sort of a moral responsibility. But there is also the academics that they have roped in, and the journalists that they've roped in, who by an unholy mix of white saviorism and intellectual laziness have chosen genocide denial as their niche market. And they do find a receptive audience amongst the people who are not educated on this issue. So what I found that is one of the issues is that, as Bruce said, the facts are there. We know we need to amplify the voices of the genocide survivors. The facts are there. We know the genocide happened. We know it happened against the Tutsis. We know it happened in '94 and 1 million people died. But there is also a gap in the education with regards to denial of genocide. I feel like this is an education that should be going hand in hand as we're learning about the genocide, everything that transpired prior to the genocide, the organization, the execution of the genocide. The aftermath should also be taught to the youth. It should be taught to the youth how they actually almost a year to the end of the genocide on the 3rd of April, on the 5th of April of 95, that's when they got together, the genocide perpetrators got together and put together a strategy to combat a strategy of genocide denial that is still persists today. But now we have this enormous access through social media. They have access to the youth. They have access to people who are not much aware of the facts. And once we educate the youth about identifying all those aspects of genocide denial, because genocide denial is quite subtle in a way, in a sense, it goes beyond mere negation of a genocide. It's about also trivialization. It's about revisionism and minimizing on all those aspects. So we need an education that goes in hand on genocide and on genocide denial. And we need to learn to spot genocide denial in its most subtle forms, because you find that these genocide denials have co-opted the language of survivors. They speak like survivors. They co-opted the stories of the survivors, but the message within is one of denial. And for someone who's not well versed in the facts, this is something that is easy to miss. So in my end, I engage them, on their own turf, which is social media. But also the approach varies depending on who it is that I'm speaking to. It is you're never going to change the mind of the child of a genocider. That's the truth. And you're never going to change the mind of an academic whose bread and butter lies in the genocide denial. They find a receptive market. They find a niche market where they can thrive. You're not going to change their mind. The strategy that I use is to inform those people in those comments, underneath that, in those comments, inform those people who might be misled by those statements, including our youth. And even in my work also, I tend to always, when we're talking about international law, I tend to bring in a case of Rwanda and case of other genocides to just showcase how this rhetoric of genocide denial is the same all across the genocides. And I think so that's what I would say is most important, to educate on the genocide, but also educate on genocide denial and all the forms that it takes.
Doris, thank you very much. I think it's the first time for both of you as guests to be on the show, and just listening to you, the passion with which you speak, with the information, the confidence. I think I speak for the resident panelists when I say we'd love to have you again once more on the show, especially when we're talking about issues of engagement with youth in issues to do with the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. Thank you very much, Doris. And Bruce, we're still keeping the conversation going. I would like us to just also inform our viewers, please share your information, your comments, your suggestions, your ideas on our social media platforms using hashtag #TheSquareRW, as you can see on our Twitter feed. And we'll get back to you later on in the show. I'd like to just now go to conversations between the squares and panelists on what you think about what Bruce has said, what Dodo have said so quite eloquently. Brian, I'll kick off with you. Same question really. What do you think are the reasons for a rising trend in genocide denial, especially amongst youth in the diaspora, and what more can we do to counter this narrative?
I think Doris just...
Yeah, I know it's hard to come in after what Doris has said about what's going on. Yeah.
I wouldn't want to repeat what she has said, but coming back home, I feel that until we all appreciate that it is our responsibility and we just don't leave it to the survivors, then we will not be able to counter successfully. And we need to, it's a painful process. It's not easy having to go back through history and explain these things, and then, as she's mentioned, go further and start to explain that you should anticipate this. you should be able to see through the denial. But I think we are at a point where it is a necessity. We can no longer say we'll deal with it along the way, because what we're seeing every year, their voices are kind of amplified, and again by the platforms, social media. So, yet when you look at us internally, look at the Commission, CNLG or Ibuka, they're not well resourced really to be able to carry out the kind of work that is needed. Yeah. So beyond saying, within your space of social media, respond, but we need our local institutions to be well resourced to respond. I'll give you an example. As of this week, I was still going through the Kwibuka website, and we had archives and not any more recent information. Now, as we know, ideally, you should be running a campaign throughout the year. You shouldn't wait for April, because these guys are not sleeping. We see them all the time. And like she said, for them, it's a business. So someone probably has a calendar, from January to December, So how do you counter that?
Yeah.
You also have to kind of make it your business. So I feel there's room to really understand that at this point, it is a necessity to have people who can make it their business to educate and engage the youth. That is one. Secondly, it's difficult when people are at a distance. But again, it is easier. We can see them. We know them from wherever they are. I want to worry more about the people who are with us here, who we don't get to know that is actually how they feel or
what they're thinking.
Yes, that is concerning. And it would be, I think, naive to imagine that we don't have them. But we have them. And probably they don't feel, they're probably scared to come out. But we want to make sure that we get to know. So there are no easy answers to this. But I feel that if we understand that it is a necessity, then we'll, one, allocate the resources that are needed to deal with it decisively. Because these people are well resourced. And it's very easy for them because, like she said, and I see this in my work as a journalist, someone will have spoken to somebody at the UN, and there's a system. Penetrating a system is very difficult, extremely difficult, She's doing what she can within her little space, but you can imagine, do people find her credible? Because first of all, if she doesn't represent a certain institution, she'll probably be branded.
And independent.
Not even that, not independent. She'll be branded a propagandist and all these things to discredit her, So how you deal with it, you have to think of a system. You're trying to deal with a system and you're trying to break a system, So I think it's high time that we took up, we rose to the challenge. Let's not leave the burden to the survivors and really be very deliberate in terms of countering and being firm.
I like the way you paint it out. It is a system. We are trying to dismantle the system, but we need to approach it understanding it's a system. And when you say that genocide deniers, revisionists, people who are divisive in terms of, the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, against that narrative, they're not sleeping. Like Doris mentioned, 1 year after the genocide against the Tutsi, they were already congregating to set up strategies on genocide denial. So I think now more than ever it's important for us to understand that. Charles, over to you. Same question. What are your thoughts?
Bruce and Doris have raised very pertinent points. I think we have a problem. In as far as the Rwandan government is concerned and the Rwandan social setup is concerned, we have built a lot of fabric around making sure that things that happened, and I'm going to be simplistic for purposes of being emphatic, that people who are killed for one reason of their ethnicity, we have made a lot of effort to make sure it never happens again. But we have never spoken to a certain segment of the people. And I'll give you a practical example of my children who are under 10 years. And sometimes I come across them and I ask them, do you know why we're on holiday? Do you know why you did not go to school today? And they will tell you that our teachers told us that it's because bad people killed good people. So we have a generational gap. And I'm glad that this show between Bruce and Doris, they're the youth. If there were people who are older than their generation, they probably not have related with this particular show. It brings me to our education. If people are being educated to be told that the genocide that happened is not the way it's being told, who else is going to tell that story apart from the youth? If we don't inculcate it in our educational program, if we don't inculcate it in our social lives, and so on and so forth, if we don't inculcate it in our families, who else is going to do it?
Absolutely.
Yes. So I think we do actually have a fundamental problem. And the first step is acknowledging that we have a problem. Yes, Dana.
Absolutely. We have a couple of tweets coming in, but I just saw one now that's echoing what you're saying, Charles, especially when it comes to talking to children. Not youth per se, the bracket is I think 18 to 35 or whatever, but children like you're talking about, under 10, like your children. I would like us to move to the next subject, here I would like to start off with Doris, based on your legal background before we come on to Mr. Murangira Bruce. But Doris, also before you respond, and also to you, Bruce, feel free to also weigh in on what the resident panelists have said. I want to talk about the legal implications. We've talked about education, we're talking about mindset, we've also looked at, why this happens, how can youth counter it, in ways available to them. The legal implications I'd like to touch on are both in and outside of Rwanda. So if you could just, Doris, take us through generally, in layman's terms, also for viewers, what do these legal provisions state when it comes to genocide denial? And also, I would also like to touch on a question, why is there some element of impunity when it comes to genocide denial of the genocide, for instance, against the Tutsi in Rwanda vis-a-vis denial of the Holocaust? You see repercussions to people who deny the Holocaust are met with much, punitive measures or legal implications than when it comes to those in Rwanda. So over to you, Doris, starting with you before we head over to Bruce.
Yes, thank you. Before we delve into the specific legal provision, it should first be determined what is understood as genocide denial in law. And by law, I mean the law of several countries, because there is no such thing as a prohibition of genocide denial in international law. It is not mentioned in the Rome Convention, which is in the Rome Statute, which is the statute that set up the ICC, and it is not mentioned in the Genocide Convention. So what we need to understand is first, what do we mean by genocide denial laws? Because there are laws of several countries which prohibit denial of genocide, and it's not many countries. You will find that it's just some countries in Europe, and outside of Europe, there's a few countries like Colombia, Israel, obviously, and Rwanda. So these countries will have provisions prohibiting to a certain extent, to different extents. So you have prohibitions that are broad, that encompass all aspects of genocide denial, and you will have prohibitions that are more restricted, that encompass only these aspects of negation, denial. Whereas the on the broader spectrum, we're talking legislation that criminalizes everything from minimizing, trivializing, doubting, and approving of a genocide, which are all aspects of genocide denial. In the Constitution of Rwanda, which is like the highest law of the land, straight away in its preamble informs us that one of its fundamental tenets is the eradication of genocide ideology and the fight against revisionism, denial, and genocide denial is denial is ideology. At the end of the day, the fight is one and the same. And a bit further in the Constitution, Article 9, I think they say that the state of Rwanda it puts a positive obligation. There is an obligation on the state of Rwanda to fight genocide ideology in all its manifestation. And genocide denial is genocide ideology. So there is an obligation on the states. And I remember the fellow panelists mentioning that we need more state effort in fighting genocide denial. This is contained in the Constitution. There is even a law that was passed in 2013 that is much more explicit on, that is meant to give effect to these constitutional provisions, and it's much more specific about genocide denial. It's quite expensive. It covers all the aspects of genocide denials, and it covers the aspects of genocide denials that are unique to the genocide against the Tutsis, because you will find commonality in denial of all genocides. The Holocaust is also denied by people. It's also all other genocides are trivialized, they're minimized, they're doubted, they're even approved and justified by other people. But there are some elements that are quite specific to the genocide against Tutsis and the denial of the genocide against Tutsis. For instance, the theory of double genocide, which is explicitly included in that 2013 legislation on genocide ideology and related offense. The theory of double genocide, this aspect is absent in all other genocides. You will I have never encountered somebody who has that theory with regards to the Holocaust or with regards to the genocide in Srebrenica. So this is quite unique to the Rwandan experience. So this law recognizes that. There are also other elements that are included in this law, which is denying that the genocide was planned. All other genocides have rarely to encounter that. And that's how you'll see that these genocide denial strategies are related, by arguing that, for instance, the RPF downed the plane of Habyarimana. You would think it's, okay, what does it matter? But it is connected to the justification of a genocide, because then it means that the genocide was not planned. It was a spontaneous outbreak of violence by people who were so angry that they had lost their president, which is simply not true. The genocide was planned, and the people were trained to kill, and they were armed to kill. So this law recognizes that and explicitly states it. There is also a very interesting aspect I found in that law that is not found in other laws on genocide denial, and that is violence against the genocide survivor. And it's this implicit recognition that denial is violence against a survivor. And it includes harassment, intimidation, mocking, insulting. And this law, with all this violence, is often directed at survivors. And I want these people on these social media platforms to realize, these people that are hiding under false identities, that they're committing offenses, criminal offenses, when they are trolling and mocking and ridiculing survivors just to push a rhetoric. This is a crime that they're committing under Rwandan law. And this law is quite expensive, and it covers all these aspects. But if we move a bit to the international sphere, as I said, there is no international law prohibition on denial of a genocide. So it is left up to the states themselves. And a lot of states find that genocide denial is, they view it as a part of the competing interest between freedom of speech and the right to dignity, which encompasses freedom from hate speech and all of that. So there's also always this balancing, and freedom of speech always wins out. But this is very interesting because you find that in the US, for instance, their freedom of speech is quite expensive. It's very hard to limit. So there is no, even with the Holocaust, you can deny it and it will still be part of your First Amendment. But when you go to Europe, those countries that have a personal connection to the Holocaust, it did occur on their territory, and it happened to their citizens. This is something that is quite strictly regulated. Now, this genocide, the Holocaust, you'll find it is regulated. Genocide denial of the Holocaust is regulated in all of its form. That encompasses denial, negation, minimalization, trivialization, all those aspects. But when it comes to other genocides and other crimes against humanity, freedom of speech is more, freedom of speech wins out in that balancing of interests. It could be because they do not feel a deep connection to those genocide as they do with the Holocaust, and it's also due to some countries having direct involvement in these genocides, and I'm talking the usual suspect: Germany, Belgium, and France. Belgium actually is much more stricter on genocides because of what transpired during the Holocaust. But Belgium and France tend to regulate more the Holocaust than the genocide of Rwanda because of their role, the active role that they played in the genocide, and also because there is this lack of connection with our plight. So yeah, the regulation is not very uniform. There's no enforcement methods, and the Holocaust is actually genocide denial of the Holocaust and that is why you find all those academics and journalists and the descendants of, not descendants because that makes them sound so remote, the children and relatives of genocide perpetrators, they find safe haven in there. And these academics also find safe haven in the denial of genocide against Tutsis, because should they deny the Holocaust, they would actually be in legal trouble. So you will find that even in the way that they talk about the genocide, they're very careful not to deny that it happened, because negating the genocide denial, the negation of the genocide, negationism is prohibited by their law, but the trivialization, the doubting, all those disparaging comments, they're not prohibited. And this is something that people in Rwanda need to understand, is that the laws in Rwanda are different from the laws in Belgium and France. These people are talking because they are legally allowed to do so. And they are there, and they are inciting you in Rwanda to break the laws of your country. They will not be there when you're in court.
Doris, thank you very much. I would like to just hear from Bruce briefly on this matter at hand. But Bruce, the reason that was also directed to Doris is because of her legal background. But Bruce, please, I would like you to just briefly weigh in as we come to the last segment of the show. You know, legal implications, if you have anything to weigh in on that, but also more so on your ideas on just touching back on the issue of mindset change and education to ensure this counter-narrative does not keep on happening amongst our youth. Over to you, Bruce.
Yeah, I think Doris really explained it very, very well. The only thing I would add is just a bit of clarity on the fact that even where, especially in Europe and other countries, there are laws against genocide denial, most of them are very specific on the Holocaust. Not on the Rwandan genocide, not on the Cambodian genocide, not on the Armenian genocide, which has actually had, I would say, more troubles getting internationally recognized than even the genocide against the Tutsi. And so you see that even if these laws are there, they're very narrow in their scope. And so that gives, a leeway to those, revisionists and deniers to be able to say whatever they want to say. And so what my contribution to what Doris has said would be to, say that what needs to happen now is to really lobby these different countries and their judiciaries to be able to include amendments that are very specific now to either, genocide in general or the genocide in Rwanda. One country I would mention where that has happened in France, where an amendment was made on the press freedom law, I think in 2017, to include provisions that actually, provide for fines and jail term for people who deny or trivialize the genocide against the Tutsi. But that was also a result of 3 years of lobbying by Rwandan activists in France. So I wouldn't say that this will pan out, positively elsewhere, but I think, we should never let our guard down. We should never say never. We should never allow ourselves to feel that, this is the way things are and there's really nothing that we can do about it. There is, and what we can do is make sure that we keep talking to the people in charge in different countries where we see this rise in denial narratives, to make sure that the legal provisions are there that ensure that denial against the genocide of the genocide against the Tutsi is criminalized.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Bruce. I'd like us to go to a Twitter feed. Before we do, Charles, Brenna, is there something you'd like to quickly add based on what our esteemed, youthful guests have shared with us regarding the role of fighting genocide denial amongst Rwandan youth? Brenna?
I think I never thought I would say this, but I've been saying this, I think, for 2 shows now. Litigation.
Yeah, you've said litigation seems to be your favorite word.
Recently.
Yes.
Yeah, and the reason I say that is because when there's a ruling, there's so much that happens after.
Yeah.
One, you've provided precedents, and then it also provides material for researchers, So at the moment, I think we haven't had enough of that, testing the law, because the laws have to be tested. That is one. 2, to also raise awareness around these laws, you really have to have litigation, I think. Without litigation, you leave them to the likes of Doris, who, are specialists, but you want as many people as possible to understand. So I feel that we need to have more litigation, 1, to raise more awareness, and 2, to test the law and also address areas that need to be strengthened.
Absolutely. Charles?
Jurisprudence is one of the best things that has happened everywhere in the world, and that's what Bana is basically referring to. We haven't had too many genocides in the world. It's a very careless statement to make, but it's legal in the sense that when you come across a judge who says, let me listen to Bagosora's position of saying, Bagosora's lawyers, that he may be applicable to parole. Yes. It's a good reason to give, but there's a bigger story. There's a much bigger story, and Doris makes very, very pertinent points. Unfortunately, we're talking about 2 different worlds. Back to my point about genocides that have not happened, we don't have a lot of experiences,
to
but
legally address them.
But also, in the Rwandan context, we have politics to manage. It's a very painful story to manage. And unfortunately, that pain, the youth do not relate with. What Doris is talking about is legal. With all due respect, she gives a very ideal situation. But we have politics to manage. How can you imagine, would we have gotten to where this country was if we had not done Gachacha, for example? Definitely not. Did Gachacha involve the youth? No, it did not. So it's a very painful situation, but I want to give kudos to where it belongs. Doris gives a perception that none of us had ever thought about. We're going through a mourning period. We do not want to hurt wounds, but I think empathy is extremely important.
What do you mean by that exactly?
Yeah, in the sense that...
To genocide survivors?
Yes,
Absolutely.
yes.
Absolutely. I'd like us to go to a Twitter feed, and the first tweet, we have quite a few coming in, and we'll try and read as much as them in the time limit that we have. The first tweet comes in from Richard, and Richard says, if you can have this on our screens, they say ignorance is the root of all misfortunes. And he goes on to say, the youth today are getting information from many sources, and some of these sources are already sick. We need to use all channels to educate young people on fighting genocide ideology. That's the first tweet that's from Richard. We have another tweet from James, who says that it is upon us or all those who know the truth to educate our fellow youths so they won't fall into the trap of genocide denial. And he echoes what we've all been saying, that really the onus is on all of us to make us all understand we're involved in this. We have a tweet from Lucy, who says that indeed we should create space for survivors to tell their stories and those of every family that perished. Who can best collect, document, and share these stories such that we create a giving platform to get this done. That is a tweet from Lucy. We have another tweet coming in from Dolapo, and Dolapo states that from time immemorial, genocide denials and revisionisms have all had the same formats. Just like the Holocaust, which happened during World War II. He says, to counter, words, media, communications, and intellectual discourse with empirical evidence would always win. Thank you, Dolapo, for giving us a tangible sort of solution. We know there's no silver bullet to this. We have a tweet coming in from Guille, I hope I pronounced it correctly, who says that I think we as youth have a big role in fighting ideology. I think we can use social media platforms to fight that ideology too. And as youth use social media a lot, we are eligible to do that. That's our tweet coming in from Guille. And then we have another tweet coming in from Dolapo, who states that on the international stage, there is a UN General Assembly resolution on genocide denials, but it is considered as the lowest level of international law. We're going to go to some more tweets. We have another tweet, if I'm not mistaken, coming in from Lucy again, before we go to some tweets that I saw coming in from Jolly, who says that enlightened by Dodo Picard, that's Doris, her contribution with the law in mind. It is important for more of us to know and use the law to fight genocide ideology. We have some tweets coming in as well, but I'd just like to state that, Bruce, thank you very much for your interventions and very informative, as well as Doris, on some of these issues on how to fight genocide ideology, especially the role of young people. We have another tweet coming in, just very quickly before we conclude, coming from Jolly. Jolly Mutesi states that we need to go back to the drawing board and mobilize young people to understand that the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi does not concern only the government or genocide survivors, but every Rwandan. We should deny a chance for people with a misplaced bias about our country. It's heartening to see that everyone is more or less saying that this is not the role of government or survivors only. We also need to pull in our weight collectively. We have another tweet coming in who says that aren't current policies in any way affecting the youth view on how important it is to talk about the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. Growing up, commemoration was arguably more emphasized than it is now. Doesn't that in itself give power to deniers and influence? And that's true. I feel like commemoration period sort of gets diluted over the years. I'm not sure if that's what he was alluding to, but I feel for younger people, it's not, for me when it was happening, I mean, we moved to Rwanda before, after the genocide happened, but it was ingrained on you. You knew every April, sometimes I think it would even be for the whole month. But now I feel like the youth, maybe it might be less ingrained in them. Last tweet for tonight also comes from Jolly, who says that, could we have this on our screens, please? Also, to deter more people from genocide denial, we need more punitive measures for any genocide denial-related crimes to establish a credible expectation that they will be held accountable. Thank you, Jolie. Definitely echoing what Doris has been sharing with us. We're coming towards the end of the show. I'd like us to give closing remarks to our guests. But Charles, I know there's something you wanted to say.
I've been itching to say something, and I think it was tickled by what Jolie said, Jolie Mutesi, and just to blend it with what Doris said. Now, let's not be naive there's a lot that's happening behind the scenes. It doesn't matter how legally well-placed we are or socially well-placed we are. People are going to take a lot of advantage for driving the youth towards whatever direction they want to take them. I know for a fact, and I think Bana has been one of the biggest drivers on this thing about youth programs in schools and what have you. Why shouldn't we? And I think this should be driven as a very, very deliberate program about genocide and what it means, and what the repercussions are.
For generations, actually.
Yes,
I think
yes,
people
yes,
need to think not just the people you've murdered.
From a curriculum perspective, actually, that's what I was looking for,
Okay.
Diana, yes. Let it be driven into our curriculum.
More than it is.
More than it is,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
I think it's just a tick in the curriculum, which is not good enough.
Absolutely. I'd like us to, Brian, is there something you'd like to say quickly?
Yeah,
I'd like us to give the last minutes.
There was a comment about social media. Now, sometimes I feel we are too optimistic around social media.
I know you like saying the majority of Rwandans are not on social media.
There's that, but also because you have no control over social media. That is one. Number two, social media works with algorithms, meaning they will show you what you like to see. Rarely would you see on your timeline what you don't want to see.
Yeah.
So that is difficult. And so I feel if we talk about social media, we should be engaging the people behind social media directly. But to imagine that if you have, 1,000, a million Rwandans on social media, you will counter. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah.
These 1,000, as long as they're saying the same thing, that's what they will see, and they will think they're making progress.
I think absolutely. I'd like us to give our closing remarks to our guests. I just really love the passion that you've come forward on this, a very important, sensitive topic, especially at this time. The passion, the information, and the dedication to countering this narrative amongst you that you've presented so far. So thank you very much. Closing remarks, very briefly, I'll start with you, Doris, before we head over to Bruce.
Yes, just a final statement, I would say that there is a tendency, a complacency that is with regards to genocide denial, especially with the generation that experienced the genocide. We feel like the facts speak for themselves and that truth will win out eventually. That is not the truth, not in this alternative truth world that we live in. A lie that is repeated more often becomes the truth. So we need to counter, and we need to meet the youth where they are, because it is the youth that is being targeted by these genocide deniers. So even if they're not on Twitter, they're on YouTube. All these videos made by the genocide deniers, they get ingrained into the minds of our youth. We need much more government support in countering these messages, and we need them to meet the youth where they are, and we need them to identify their peers that can educate them, because the youth is more likely to receive information from their peers than when they feel it is a sermon from the government or from their teachers. So all of these multidimensional approach to genocide denial will need heavy, important government support in that sense. And we will also need a lot of lobbying from all these groups, all these diaspora groups and all the groups that live in Rwanda. That we need the financial resources actually to combat genocide denial. This cannot be done ad hoc like by us, and it cannot be done traditionally by these organizations that are combating genocide denial, but in a traditional sense that no longer appeal or reaches the targeted audience. So we need to adapt to this new world we're in, and we need concerted, cohesive efforts to combat the genocide.
Thank you very much. Concerted efforts and really adapt to this. I like the way you said the world of alternative facts. People keep on repeating a lie so often, it becomes a truth. Thank you very much, Doris. Hope to have you on the show again. And thank you. I would like us to just move over to Bruce, give closing remarks. Bruce, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'll talk about three things very quickly. One is something that Charles talked about the youth not being very connected to the pain that comes with the genocide, and I would say that I disagree with that. The youth is very connected. When we have among our youth, people who were born out of rape, and when we have people who grew up without literally, hundreds or maybe dozens of members of their families that they're not seeing around, when we have youth who have grown up with parents in prison because of the genocide, one way or another, we are connected. The issue is, how do we deal with that connection? If we have, again, parents who are very silent about what they're experienced because they feel like that is the only way to protect us, when the reality is that we see how painful it is for them, then sometimes we do choose to, get that out of our minds, for lack of a better word. So what I would say is, first of all, talking to parents, talk to your children, be open about what you experienced, what you went through, because they do realize what you're dealing with. But the fact that you are silent about it means that they do not have a way to process their own pain that they've received, that they've acquired from your experiences. So talk to them, be open, and in that way, they'll also be much more open and much more willing to learn about the genocide and all its implications. And number two, like everybody else said, education. And when talking about education, what I would say is less of talking at youth and more of talking to the youth. And that comes with, not just laying out the facts of what happened, but helping them to process the, as I said before, what are the cultural reasons? What are the society, the things in our societal makeup that allowed for such mass violence to happen? Why is it important that we realize that? Why is it important that we realize that we need to be very, very, open about the symptoms in order to be able to fight them? So education. But education also starts at home, so talk to your kids, talk to your children. Be open about your experiences.
Bruce, thank you so much. It's really been an honor and a pleasure having you and Doris on this show. Thank you so much. Thank you to our viewers who've tuned in and shared their perspectives, their thoughts, echoing what our guest panelists and the resident panelists have said. Thank you so much for a great contribution to tonight's very important discussion, very important conversation. Berna, great to have you on the show as always. Thank you very much. Charles, great to have you.
Always a pleasure.
I hope you'll be talking to your kids very soon about this very difficult topic. Thank you much to our partners, Uzi Collections and Bourbon Coffee. To our viewers, keep the conversation going. See you again next week. We'll also have another topic on the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi as we commemorate the 27th year. Thank you very much. Have a good night. See you again next week.